Welcome to Fort Leboeuf French and Indian War Museum in Waterford, Pennsylvania. I'm going to start my story in the year 1753. If you were here in 1753, you would not be standing in Pennsylvania. This is Virginia. It's also known as the Ohio country. That's if you're British. If you're indigenous, then this is Seneca territory, part of the Iroquois Confederacy. If you're French, this is part of New France. So you have three cultures here vying for dominance of this land, known as the Ohio country. Early in 1753, the royal governor of Virginia, his name is Robert Dinwiddie. He is hearing rumors that the French have moved down into the Ohio country. And being that he's appointed by the king, his responsibility is to maintain the king's empire and his colonies. And so he needs to do something about it. He needs to act. And what he does is he enlists the services of a young 21-year-old George Washington. He promotes him. He gives him a commission in the Virginia militia as a major, and he assigns him a task of verifying the rumors, finding out where the French are, and then seeing what their motives are, delivering a letter, waiting for a response, and bringing the response back. This is a diplomatic mission. George Washington doesn't come alone. He has never been this far north, even though he's used to wilderness life. He's never been this far north. So he enlists the help of a guide by the name of Christopher Gist. George Washington also lacks the ability to speak any French. So he needs an interpreter. So he brings an interpreter by the name of Jacob von Braun and about 12 other Virginia militia to really act as baggage handlers, to carry all the supplies and materials that they're going to need on this mission. George Washington leaves Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia, on October 31st. He arrives right here at the door of the fort on December 11th, 1753. And this is what he finds. He finds the main fort, the main part of the fort already constructed. The outer bastion works are being constructed. But most alarming to George Washington is that there are two boat yards here building boats. And these boats are called bateaux. They're flat-bottom barges, and they're used primarily to move materials and supplies. He notes in his journal about 200 of these boats under different stages of construction. George Washington stays here 5 days. The first night, he is put up in the officers. He's welcomed in the fort. He's put up in one of the officers' quarters. The next day, when his entourage arrives, he sets up about a quarter mile from the fort. He sets up his camp, and he stays, like I said, for 4 days. While he's here, he is given carte blanche to roam around and take notes about what he sees. The French are encouraging it, actually, because they're here and the British are not. The British are on the other side of the mountains. So he waits for those 5 days, he gets a response, and he heads back. Now, he's held up a little bit in what is modern-day Pittsburgh, a town on the northern shore of the Ohio. Today, the town's called Ambridge. Back then, it was called Logstown. It was a huge Native American village that the Iroquois were responsible for. This is Iroquois country. He can't just wander up here on his own. He needs to get permission, and then he's going to be escorted by a small contingent of Native Americans, including this fellow right here. His name to us is the Half King. His native name is Tanacherison. And he's going to play a vital role in this story.
You mentioned that the French were helping the Americans, or were pre-America, but that continued in the Revolutionary War as well, right?
Well, let me tell you why the French are here. All right. So we know the British are here since 1607. They get a charter to start Jamestown, and that charter includes this area. The French are here because they have two colonies that they're trying to connect. They have their colonies up in Canada, like Montreal, Quebec. They have a colony in Louisiana. And they want to try and connect those two colonies. And the way they're going to do that is through the interstate highway system of the 18th century, which is water. So the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, the Ohio and Mississippi River drainage, down to the Gulf of Mexico. You could put a boat in the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth of the St. Lawrence, and you could reach the Gulf of Mexico by boat and only have to take your boats out of the water twice. The first one is to get around Niagara Falls. The second one is to get from present-day Presque Bay in Erie, Pennsylvania to this spot right here, which is 15 miles. It's called a portage or a portage. Once you're here, just below the fort is a creek known as Leboeuf Creek. About 3 miles down the road, it empties into French Creek. 50 miles further down, French Creek empties into the Allegheny, and then at what is known as the Forks of the Ohio, present-day Pittsburgh, that is where the gateway to the west originates. Whoever controls the Forks of the Ohio controls the interior part of North America. And so both the British and the French recognize that, and the French are on their way to claim that spot. And the British are playing catch up. In this area, we are telling the story of the indigenous people, the original people, people that we refer to today as Native Americans. This is a typical northeastern woodland village. This is one family unit. This isn't one tribe. This is one family unit. This is a matriarchal society, meaning that the women, everything's done through the women. Everything is traced through the women's lineage. So, for instance, a man and a woman get married. The man leaves his village and moves into his wife's village. They don't have surnames like Europeans do. They identify by clans, and clans are divided into two types. There are land-water clans, like for instance turtle, snipe. There are also land clans, so land animals, bears, wolves, all right? Those two different kinds of clan groups can't marry within their own group. They have to seek partnerships outside of there. So, for instance, a turtle could marry a bear. So let's say the husband is Turtle Clan, the wife is Bear Clan. Any children that are produced in that match are going to identify as bear. All of their moral teachings are going to be conducted through the wife's male relatives, her brothers, her uncles, her father, her grandfathers. This is an extended family that lives in this village. So everybody's related through the female side. So who lived here in this area? Well, we would call them today the Iroquois. The French referred to them as the Iroquois. They did not like that name. That's not a very nice name. It was given to them by a rival tribe on the other side of the Great Lakes, the Huron. It means those that crawl on their belly, or snakes. So their enemies named them snakes. They call themselves the Haudenosaunee, meaning the people of the longhouse. And that's not a literal interpretation. It's not because they live actually in longhouses. It's sort of like a metaphor for how they view society. That people live communally in this big home together, and that the ends can constantly be added to as more people join their group. It's made up, at this time in the 18th century, it's made up of 5 different tribes. And those tribes are, I like to talk about it as, I'm a Pennsylvanian, right? But I'm an American. They would identify as whatever their tribe is, so Seneca, but they're Haudenosaunee. It's a confederacy. In fact, our form of government is based on this type of government. Ben Franklin was a student of the Iroquois and liked what he saw and adopted a lot of it when the Constitution was being written. In this society, work is divided into 2 separate domains. You have field and you have forest. Men work in the forest, women work in the field. It's known as life givers and life takers. Women are life givers. They give birth, they plant and feed and nurture the group. They tend to the sick, elderly, and young, so they're life givers. Men are life takers. They have to go out and get the fields ready, so they have to chop down forests to get fields ready for the women to plant. They have to go out and hunt and fish, meaning they have to harvest animals from the environment. They also go to war. So they're life takers. They have this philosophy that they live by called one dish, one spoon. So in this group, everybody works that can work, and everybody eats. There's no class system here. There are what Europeans would refer to as chiefs. They would call themselves sachems. These are people that are both political and religious. These are males. But we have clan mothers that are really in charge. So some of the older females of the group are the clan mothers. They appoint the sachems or the chiefs. The chiefs meet. They come up with like ideas and things that they want to accomplish, and then they have to go back to the clan mothers for approval. Nothing happens without the clan mother's approval. Now, there's an interesting scene that's taking place here in this model. If you can see right here, you see a column of people and folks that are sort of running through that column, hunched over. And the people on either side of the column have like sticks and they have their fists up, and somebody even has a knife. What's happening here is something known as running the gauntlet. So I'm going to back up a little bit and explain what that entails. Since 1492, the native peoples of the Americas have been exposed to European diseases that they are not immune to. So they've been dying off by the tens, if not hundreds of thousands. So by 1750s, their numbers have dwindled. And while all of this is happening, they're watching Europeans flood the continent. And they're sitting around wondering how much time they have left. Or when are we going to become extinct? How can we combat this? And there are really only 2 practical ways to combat it. One is to procreate. And they're doing that. They're trying that, right? But it takes 20 years to replace a person in a society. From the time you conceive, give birth, raise that person up to be an adult, that is about a 20-year period. They don't see that they have 20 years. Another way to do that is to take and adopt people into your group. So they're going to go out onto the frontier. They're going to raid homesteads. They're going to take captives. They're going to bring those captives back to the villages. All along that route, those captives are going to be tested and weeded out. So by the time they get back to the village, only the ones that truly are strong enough to survive have made it. But that doesn't guarantee you're going to live. If you make it back to the village, you are given one final test, and that test is the villagers haven't seen you yet. So they're going to come out and they're going to form this line, and you're going to be forced to run through it as they pummel you with clubs, rocks, rotten fruit, punch you, kick you, whatever. Even if you make it through that, you have a 50-50 chance of living. Because the way this works is, let's say somebody in the village lost a loved one in a battle, and so they're in mourning for that person. Maybe it was their brother. My job as a young warrior is to go out, find somebody, and bring them back and present them to you. So I'm going to present my captive to you, and you have a decision to make. Do I want to end my mourning by avenging my brother's death and moving on? If you choose that, then that captive is going to face torture and eventual death. It's going to be a few days of torture, which is going to end their life. Or the other alternative is, I miss my brother so much that I want to replace him. I want him back. So I'm going to adopt that person. And by adopting that person, they become a full-fledged member of our group. They're not slaves. They're not going to be treated like slaves. They're going to live by that philosophy, one dish, one spoon. When we eat, they eat. When we work, they work. When we starve, they go hungry as well. So that's what's playing out here. And the French are encouraging it because the British are the ones that are trying to populate North America. The French are only here for one reason, and we're going to talk about that in the next room. So in this gallery, what we're trying to show is the reason why the French were here. The French and the British really have two different ideas of how they view North America. But the reason why they're here in North America is because by the 1750s, all of the major empires in the world have really dwindled down to two: Great Britain and France. The Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they've sort of gone by the wayside. So you have these two empires that are competing with one another for world dominance. And to do that, it takes capital. It takes an enormous amount of money, because to rule the world, you need to have a huge military. And the biggest and most expensive part of a military in the 18th century is a navy. You've got to patrol all of the world's oceans, essentially, because you have colonies spread out all over the world. So how are you going to pay for that? Well, the British are going to do it through diversity. They're going to diversify. They're going to be involved in sugar trade. They're going to be involved in rum. They're going to be involved in agriculture like tobacco. They're going to dabble in the fur trade. The French, they go all in on the fur trade. This is $1 billion a year business at the time of this venture. Now, the way that the British view native people, the indigenous people, the British view them as in the way. If we're going to populate North America, we need land, and you're on it, and you're not. And their view is they're not utilizing it because the native form of agriculture looks way different than European agriculture, and so they look out at the landscape and say, "Oh, this is not being used," right? So they just want the Indians to go away. Really, they're in the way. The French, however, see it differently. They depend on the natives to supply the furs for this fur trade. They're the ones going out and trapping and bringing the furs in. So their approach is, instead of bringing women to marry and build families and build farms, the French aren't bringing women with them. They're bringing priests. And the reason for the Jesuit priests are to convert those natives to Christianity so that they can become part of the French Empire. They're going to be French, citizens in the view of the king. So this room is set up as what items would be in a trading post, what items the soldiers here would have brought with them. We have examples of uniforms that the French wore here. So like French Marine uniform there. The main fur that they're looking for is this. This is the beaver. They'll take any furs. Any furs will work. But the beaver is the most sought after. And what they're doing with these furs is they're making felt hats. In the 18th century, you live in a very filthy world. Your daily life is open hearth cooking, open hearth heating, working outside either in a trade that's dirty like blacksmithing or agriculture. And you're only taking, on average, 2 plunge baths a year, 2 full body baths a year. The rest of the time you're washing up in a little basin, and typically only the exposed parts of your body. So you're trying to cover everything else up to keep it from getting dirty, including your head. There are laws on the books at this time in some of the European cities where it's illegal to leave your home without a head covering. So hats are super important. And so you have these venture capitalists in Europe who are funding this industry, this fur trade. And then they're taking this fur, turning it into a product, hats, which then will be taxed, and that tax will go to the coffers of the king to fund the empire. So that's how the money's being made here. This is a very dangerous business for the people back in Europe who work in the hat industry. There's that famous Alice in Wonderland character, the Mad Hatter, right? Who is really dying from the chemicals that he's exposed to in one of these hat factories. Life expectancy in the hat factories is not very long, but it is a $1 billion business. So what would happen is the furs would come into a trading post, and that's why the military's here. Because if we're going to set up trading posts, we need to secure that. It's just like today. I mean, economics hasn't really changed much. If you have an interest in something in the Middle East, like oil, you're going to send your military there to protect that. But is the military getting the money? No, the government's getting the money, or the capitalists are making the profit of it. But the military's going to support it, right? And that's what's happening here. So we're going to set up trading posts. Native people are going to bring in these furs, and they're going to trade them for European goods that they do not have. Native Americans at this time period, they do not have metallurgy technology. They can't make their own metal. So if I live in a village and my wife sees that her sister in the village, her sister's husband, went out and brought her back a brass kettle like we have in our display case there, guess what my wife's going to be telling me? I better go get one. Because the alternative is I have to go out, my wife has to go out, harvest clay, work the clay, fire the clay, hope that some of the pots survive the firing, just so I can have a cooking vessel. And then all it takes is one little accident to drop it and break it. I got to start the whole process over. But if my husband traps a few beavers, which they're everywhere, he can bring me home one of those brass kettles that could last a lifetime, right? It's like really like going from washing your clothes in a stream and beating them on rocks to now owning a washing machine. It's taking you light years into the future, the new technology. So that's all it takes. So the Indians are in, and the French are taking advantage of that. But the British are also fur trading as well. So it's not just the French, but the French are all in on the fur trade. The only two artifacts in this museum that we can say for sure are from this site. Now we have 18th century things. So we have period pieces that could have been here, but we don't know that they were from here. The only two items that we know were from here is this bale seal. This bale seal here that was found by a private citizen in town and donated to us. And this partisan, which is the top part of a big pike or spear. It was found in somebody's backyard. Both French. Now the bale seal is interesting because the bale seal is when the furs would come into a trading post and they would be traded for, now they have to be bundled. They have to be processed and bundled. And then they have to be shipped back up to Canada so that they can be boarded on ships and taken over to Europe. Now, if I'm the venture capitalist that funded these furs, I want to make sure that my furs get to me. So I'm going to have these lead seals made. And when my furs are ready to ship, they're going to be tagged that they're mine so that when they come back to France, they know where to deliver them, who the owner of that cargo is. So that's what that bale seal is. It was found right out back here in Leboeuf Creek. This was found in somebody's backyard in town. Now I talked about the British had a claim since 1607, Jamestown. The indigenous people have lived here for thousands of years. So how do the French claim this? Well, starting in the 1720s, the French are starting to explore the Great Lakes and the Mississippi-Ohio River Valley. They come back in 1749 with an expedition known as Celeron's expedition. He's the leader of the expedition. And what he's going to do is he's going to look for a navigable route down through the Mississippi Valley. And at every important water junction, like where a stream runs into a river, they're going to bury these lead plates. And these lead plates essentially say that we now claim this land for King Louis XV. We only know of two that exist today. That's a replica. The two that we know exist, one is in Virginia, the other is in Ohio, in museums. However, the Seneca Nation claims to also have two. What we think happened to all these plates, because you would think that they buried all these plates, you'd be able to find them, and we haven't. What we think was happening was the native people in those areas were watching as this group moved on. They were digging those up and melting them down for musket bullets. So that's why there's so few today that survive. That's our theory. This room is, like I said before, it's our multi-purpose room. We do have one display here of some European items. These are French. This part of the case, these are all tools that would have been used in constructing these frontier forts. Over here we have, we're really excited about this item. It's a breech loading swivel gun, which is essentially a small cannon that can be mounted on a fence or a stump or the bow of a small boat. And we just acquired that a couple weeks ago. A private donor graciously gave that to us.
Wow.
These cases here on the back wall, these are all items that are native, and some of them date back to thousands of years, 2,000 years, some of them do.
Are these all found locally?
In the region, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Not so much in this town,
Right.
but in this area.
Okay.
We do have some things in here that were found locally. We're still finding things. We have out back here, the creek floods every spring. And when it recedes, it washes up bits of china or crockery, pottery, and so we find it. But those are always end up being European and attributed to the 3 forts that were here. We've only found small evidence of native artifacts here. The Revolutionary War is a direct result of this war. The stage in this war is set for us to become independent.
My understanding is that when the French and the British fought during the Seven Year War, the French were still upset after the war was over. That's why they helped the Americans in our quest for independence, basically.
Exactly. And the only conflict that happens here, because there are 3 forts here on this site. The first fort is the original French fort, 1753. When Fort Duquesne falls to the British in 1758, the French leave and they come up through their frontier and they burn and destroy their other forts. The British then move in a year later and construct a fort right on the ruins of the French fort. They are not very imaginative. They also call their fort Fort Leboeuf. So, but they're there until 1763. When the war's over, land is exchanged between the French and the British, right? The only concession really that the natives get is the British promise to halt the expansion across the Appalachian Mountains. So they draw this imaginary line called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And they make it a law that people can't move across that. Well, who's going to enforce it? They're 3,000 miles away in England, and people are coming here and just going. And the Indians feel like they've been lied to. And so up in the Detroit area today, there's a native warrior, a sachem up there by the name of Pontiac, who rallies other young warriors, and they decide to rebel. And they come down through and they burn, for instance, Fort Presque, which is 15 miles away. They come here and lay siege to this British fort. There's only about 12 men garrisoned here at the time. The Indians watch as they all retreat into the fort. They light their arrows on fire and shoot it into the building, and then they sit and wait. They're either going to come out where they can kill them, or they're going to stay inside and burn to death. Fortunately, that fort sat on a piece of ground that didn't drain very well, so at some point in one of the fort's constructions, there was a drainage ditch that led down to the creek, so that when it rained in the fort, that water had a place to go. Those men crawled out and spent the night out into the swamps, and the next morning they came back and the Indians were gone, and they were able to regroup. And they also headed south to the next fort, which was known as Fort Venango. Originally Fort Machault by the French, then Fort Venango. When they got there, completely burned to the ground, still smoldering, and all of the bodies charred and dead. So they headed to Fort Pitt, where they found sanctuary. standing at the end of the Washington Trail. The Washington Trail begins in Williamsburg and ends right here. It's 500 miles one way. So George Washington's trip was 1,000 miles around. This road that you see here is an ancient Indian trail. It's about 2,000 years old. It connects the northern shore of the Ohio River to the southern shore of Lake Erie. It was known as the Venango Trail. You had asked about the fort. If you turn around, you can see that high ground there. That was the main fort. That was the main body of the fort. And then there were outer bastion works. If you look at this map, I'll show you. We're right about here, standing in this park. The museum is right about there. That White House sits right here, and this building sits right here. To give you kind of an idea of where the fort was. This is our George Washington statue. He's going to turn 100 years old next year. He was commissioned in 1919. The citizens of this town decided they needed to commemorate his visit, and so they started raising money. It cost $10,000 to have this statue built. A husband and wife team named Kilpatrick from Washington, D.C. was given the task of sculpting and casting this statue. He's made of bronze, and he weighs 1 ton, and he is life-size. What the sculptors did was they went back to George Washington's correspondence with his tailor in London to get all the measurements. In his hand is the letter. When we get young visitors today, they want to know why he has a cell phone. And some say, oh, does he have a hot pocket? But it's the letter that he's delivering. It's the only known statue in the United States or the world where George Washington is in a British uniform. But it's not regular army, it's Virginia militia. But it's a British uniform, nonetheless. Originally, this statue sat in the middle of the road, and it sat there until about 1948. Prior to that, from 1922 up until the World War II, this road didn't have this much traffic, and most of the traffic was still horses and buggies. But then we had this war, and our young men went off to fight overseas. While they were fighting, they were getting a pay that they weren't spending, and they did what any red-blooded American boy is going to do when they have some cash. They're going to buy an automobile. This road almost overnight turned into cars, and the fear was that he was going to get struck by a car. So they moved him. He sat way back there behind these trees until 1999, when again the citizens said, hey, you know, George Washington's being neglected back there, nobody's coming to visit him anymore, let's get him visible. So this park was created, and he was moved here.
Can you explain again why he was in a British uniform?
So at that time, we're just British. It's 1753. There are British colonies, of which he lives in one of them, Virginia. He is given, and the regular British Army aren't here in North America yet. They're going to arrive once he's done with this mission. The governor of Virginia is going to publish his notes into book form. That book is going to be sent and published and distributed in England, where it's going to give Parliament and the King an idea of what's happening, and they're going to start sending regular British troops over. So the troops that are really policing over here are militia groups. And so he's in a Virginia militia uniform. It's a blue jacket with red facing and a red waistcoat, they're known as Virginia Blues. On this mission, he was a major. On his return, he will be promoted to colonel. His ambition in life was to be a regular officer in the regular British Army. That's all he wanted. And if he would have been given that, who knows what would have happened.
Exactly.
On this trip, he almost dies twice on the way back. Once he's shot at close range by a Native American. The bullet just whizzes past his head. He survives that, only to fall into the icy Allegheny River at present-day Pittsburgh, where his guide, Christopher Gist, pulls him to safety. They spend the night on an island in the middle of that river. It's so cold that night that the next day they just walk across the river. It's frozen solid. So he almost died of hypothermia.
And where did he exactly deliver the letter in this?
So he came and the fort was right there. So he delivered the letter to the fort. Originally he tried to deliver the letter to the fort that's south of us. It was known as Fort Machoke. They refused to accept the letter. They told him that they didn't have the authority, that he needed to come up here. So he came up here, and this the commanding officer here also told him he couldn't do it. He needed to go further north to Fort Presque Isle. George Washington refused to do that, and so they sent for the commanding officer from Fort Presque Isle to come down, and these two guys spent the next couple days responding to the letter, writing the rebuttal, which George Washington took back with him. At the dedication of this statue, our town has always had about the same population. We fluctuate around 1,100 people in the borough, and that's give or take 100 or so. At the time of the dedication, it was about 1,100 people. 1,500 visitors showed up to the dedication, including the governor of the state. Here's a picture of that building across the street. And the grandson of the Marquis de Lafayette gave a keynote speech that day. Marquis de Lafayette, who was actually George Washington's protege during the Revolution, actually visited this site, stayed in an inn that is now over where the post office sits. He stayed there because he wanted to visit all the places that George Washington had been in his life, and this was a significant one. Near the end of George Washington's life, he was asked to write his memoir, his autobiography. So he started, and he completed 13 pages, and then he stopped. And those 13 pages are exclusively the French and Indian War and this mission. So the Marquis wanted to come here and see what George Washington saw. And then it's kind of cool that during the dedication of the statue, his grandson came and gave a keynote speech. The newest thing that we added last year is the Soldiers' Garden. So there were gardens here. The supplies for the soldiers were coming from Quebec. A lot of times they didn't make it here, or the food would end up arriving spoiled or rancid. So the men here were suffering from something called scurvy, including the commanding officer of this fort died just a few days before George Washington embarked on this trip of scurvy. So the men were encouraged to plant their own gardens to combat scurvy. And that's what we're representing back here, a typical soldier's garden of the time period. So all of the plants that are planted there are 18th century varieties. There's no modern varieties in there at all. And then the cottage would have been the men garrisoned here for a long period of time, would have lived outside of the fort, and they would have traded their tents in for small huts.
What year was that?
This is in the the 1930s.
Okay.
30s.
Wow.
Originally, he didn't even have this fence around him. But then as automobile traffic started, they were like, well, we'll put a wrought iron fence around it. And then that, you know, that got hit a couple times, and they're like, no. And this house that you see in the background there,
Yes.
that's that gray house down there.
Okay.
This blue house is out of the frame of the shot, but it was here. It's the only picture we have of any of the forts.
Wow.
It sat on this spot,
Oh,
just,
right here.
just
Okay.
behind the trees.
Okay. Great.
But in the mid 1800s, a chambermaid working in the inn over here was disgruntled. So she came out and she set this blockhouse on fire because it was being used as an inn as well, so just cheaper lodging. The bottom part was like a farrier, like shoe horses and stuff. And then she went back inside and lit that on fire and gutted the whole inside of it.
Wow.
Yeah. She must have been really upset.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for the
Oh, you're
tour.
welcome.
This is amazing.
Yeah.
A lot of great history here.